that I graduated in December of 1985 as an American Studies major. I don't know, I think, trying to think about what I would share with you guys today. First part is, the last thing we want is to just hear me talking nonstop for the next hour and whatever, so please feel free to just, ask questions, make comments, and maybe we can have a little conversation going back and forth. Because one of the neat things I think about my career, and actually the bio is not totally current because I've just started a new job. I'm on the second week of a new job, so I don't think the bio has it on it, but I've worked for the federal government, I've worked in private industry, and I'm now working for a nonprofit. So those are all similar in many ways, different in many other ways, and how they address sustainability issues can be, different. Can have different sort of attitudes and approaches, although perhaps they might all be successful if they all approach some parts of it in the same way. Let me just quickly give a little more color to my career, because I think I'm going to talk about sustainability not only from the private corporation point of view, but also refer back to my time in government, the organization I'm at now, as well as a volunteer project I'm doing, particularly a climate crisis task force in my county back home in New York. So I left here, I got a master's of environmental management, I got a PhD in arid land agroforestry, and all along my thought was, I really think that you have to have these sort of interdisciplinary teams to address what I think at the time we're sort of calling natural resource management, international development, or conservation sorts of issues. It wasn't necessarily being called sustainability or stewardship at the time. But there weren't too many places where that was being done. There weren't too many graduate programs where that was being done, and there certainly weren't undergraduate programs where that was being done that I was aware of. And there weren't too many organizations who were doing this sort of work. So I sort of tried to construct my career so that I would be building, layering on certain skills, whether one was doing my doctoral research in the deserts in Israel, or doing 6 months of research for a friend of mine in Madagascar, so I got tropical experience as well. And then, policy experience, hands-on experience working with farmers when I was at USDA, the Department of Agriculture. I guess let me start there. So when I worked for the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I was working with farmers in the Catskill Mountains in New York. Anyone here from New York? Anyone here a farmer? One. Wow. I would just interject also. I know, this isn't science to say a data point of 1, but this is the first time I've been in a sustainability group, class, or otherwise, where it's predominantly men instead of women. I don't know if that's a trend that it's sort of equalizing out, which it should. That's interesting. So I would work with farmers, and they of course were focusing on the sustainability of their business, right? Of their farming operations, and they would say that we're also very focused on stewarding the land, because if these resources aren't here tomorrow and in good shape tomorrow, then my operation won't be able to be sustainable, and I won't have anything to hand on to my kids. But coming from an environmental background as I did, I sort of would see, well, there's a lot of opportunity for improvement, but improvement only came with a sort of collaborative approach. So you might hear in this country, or anyone who comes from a different country, there's a lot of people who say, I don't like regulation. It's just too onerous for me. But sometimes regulation is needed when people aren't protecting resources. I guess a lot of these farmers would have said, you know, we're following all the rules and regulations, so of course we're probably being sustainable. And I would say, well, actually, there's more that you can do. You know, I don't know if this is how you sort of looked at sustainability. To me, it's sort of going beyond regulation. It's going even further and deeper and wider and broader. So we would address, the only way I could be successful was to address these environmental issues in a way that was clearly sensitive to their need for their operations to succeed. And so it wasn't just, this is the Beth Sauerhaft way. It was, let's figure out how we can do this together. And I think that's been sort of a theme throughout my career. Oh yeah.
Were you working mainly with like small time farmers, or also with like the big agriculture companies?
So at that time, I was working with mostly dairy farmers. I don't know if you know that part of New York State. It's not the area where there's, yeah, so it's not, it's smaller farms like at the rest of the New England states. It's nothing like the farms in upstate New York or the rest of the Midwest here. So it might have been 200 to 500 milking head of cattle, growing some hay and alfalfa and corn. And then there would be some vegetable garden folks who were growing crops, fruits and vegetables to sell to the urban markets. Then I went to EPA, and I was working on agricultural environmental issues. And there too, it became clear that the only way that you can't, in my opinion, you can't successfully regulate in a very narrow-minded way. You've really got to understand the industry that you're regulating and understand why they do what they do, so that the regulations can enable them to succeed, but in a way that, in this case, protects our natural resources. So there's a lot of collaboration that's needed there, a lot of learning about one another and your motivations there. And then I went to work at PepsiCo, which was the second largest food and beverage company in the world. They not only make carbonated beverages, the sodas, they also make things like Gatorade, Tropicana, Lay's potato chips, Doritos, sour hummus, Quaker oatmeal. I mean, it's a huge array of foods, snacks, beverages, and products that are healthier for us. Fun for us, healthier for us, whatever. And there, I was given the question by my boss. We had done this future scenarios project where we were saying, what are 20 or 30 years from now, what are some of the challenges and threats and opportunities that the company is likely to face? And this is a multinational company, sells products in more countries than there are in the United Nations, and has huge supply chains, agricultural and otherwise. And so one of the things that this Future Scenarios project pointed out is that the agricultural supply chain is going to be one of the biggest areas of risk, but also a huge area of opportunity. Opportunity because you can help feed people at the base of the pyramid, very poor people who are really trying to eke out a living and just focused on getting food on the table today. As well as the risks being things like climate change, and how does climate change impact political stability or instability. I think a lot of people would say that the Arab Spring was caused in part by climate change and food insecurity. So we had this Future Scenarios project. We had done, I had done a bunch, and a lot of my colleagues had done some carbon footprints of products. So that's looking at you guys talk about life cycle analysis and carbon footprints? Okay, so suppose you have a product. You have this pencil case. You think about all the raw materials that go into this pencil case. A lot of petroleum because it's mostly plastic. And how much energy goes into extracting the raw materials and then doing the value add of the raw materials and then making this pencil case and then delivering it to a store where you can go buy it. So how much energy, fuel, electricity, carbon that is extracted from the ground when you need to refine petroleum to make it into this plastic product. And so for food and beverage companies, some of the biggest pieces of the carbon footprint come from growing the agricultural raw material. So then you start to say, wow, that's probably the place where we can really have our biggest impact of reducing risks, being productive, and improving resiliency. Because what if you don't get the potatoes to the back door of the plant that you need for Lake's potato chips on a regular basis? What if the farmers are not making a living wage? What if there are health issues? What if there are human rights violations in your supply chain? What if their farms aren't economically viable? So all these triple bottom line issues start to really become important in thinking about the stability of the company. And we also did water footprints, so how much water is embedded, sort of used in each part of the life cycle of these products. And again, it brought the company back to to agriculture. So when my boss said, what do we do, Beth? Because she knew I come from an ag background, I said, oh, well, we've got to do this whole farm planning stuff. We've got to think about sustainability on the farm. And many people in so the people that I would work with, it's this global bunch of people, and it was really interesting that my American colleagues would tend to think right away about the environmental impacts of things. Those folks who either were Americans who had worked for the company overseas or were non-American, living and working overseas, would say, yeah, the environmental issues are really important, but what about the social sustainability issues, human rights issues, health and safety? And that was a really new area for the company to get into. It was very interesting. I mean, there's, the HR people are always thinking about employee health and safety and what's your accident rate in a manufacturing plant. But as far as going back into your supply chain and thinking about what are some of the risks that we have in our supply chain from a social point of view, that at the time it wasn't being done all that much in the food and beverage industry. Many of you, let's see, you guys are like in your teens, early 20s. If you may have heard about I'm going to say the name wrong, it's like the Rana Plaza, was it in Bangladesh? There were some factory fires in the fashion industry. People who they didn't have fire extinguishers, they didn't have proper ventilation, they couldn't get out of the building when there were fires, and this became a huge liability for the fashion industry. And people started looking at what is in your supply chain, and it became, you're no longer responsible for just what's in the four walls of your company, but a company is now responsible for their entire supply chain. It's like knowing what your seventh cousin 7 times removed is doing and what their name is, right? And most of us don't know that. So this became a Herculean task, not only for PepsiCo, but for other food and beverage companies, the fashion industry, for pretty much any company to start thinking about what are these issues. So have you guys talked a lot about human rights issues? No? Yes? Some? So, not here. So throw out what some of the issues are. What do you think some of the concerns are for human rights issues? What are things that you guys talk about in your dorms every day? I hope. Yes?
I was going to say poor working conditions,
Okay. Poor working conditions, like what?
like really hot factories or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were recently some stories about, Amazon, I think, right, with their acquisition of Whole Foods. Yeah, what else?
Maybe like minimum wage.
Minimum wage, right, so are you getting a minimum wage? And if you're getting a minimum wage, is that the same as a living wage? Can you really live on $15 a day? Yeah.
Like not all workplaces have like all access to facilities, like bathrooms and everything.
Absolutely. So I went to look at a palm oil factory in Costa Rica, and these were these like tall palm trees, and the guys would use these really long sticks to get the fruit off of it, where they get the oil from. And I remember asking someone, so, I don't see any facilities here, I don't see an outhouse, and, you know, I suppose guys especially, you can just go find a tree and whatever, but I said, what do? Oh, well, they have to go back to their homes, you know, like a little ways away to go to the bathroom. Well, what happens if the facilities aren't there and you have to take off half an hour to go home to go to the bathroom? If you're being paid by the hour or you're being paid by the weight that you harvest, you're missing out on salary. So it's not fair. Or it may not be hygienic. Anything else? Yeah. Break times, right. So in essence, slavery, right? Forced labor. The people, are you making people work 7 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year? They're working really long days without breaks, without time, without water, without bathroom breaks. What else?
Workplace accidents?
Yeah, workplace accidents, right. You know, farms, there's a lot of accidents on farms, and especially if you're not really focusing on accident mitigation. How about child labor? Anyone hear about that within the chocolate cocoa industry? So one of the challenges is, okay, suppose that I'm company A, I contract with you in the Adidas shirt for, I don't know, 1,000 kilos of ingredient X, but you're not really the grower of ingredient X, you're just sort of the aggregator, or you do the final value add, and you're buying some stuff from her, some from him, some from him, some from him, right? And I don't necessarily have visibility into that. I'm just sort of having a contract with you, but you are subcontracting with these guys, and you might be subcontracting with 2 or 3 more people beyond. And so it rapidly becomes a headache, to put it bluntly or lightly, of how do you get transparency in your supply chain. And then, yeah.
I'll just kind of go off of that and ask your opinion. So like, for example, Nike would subcontract a lot of their work. And so let's say they go to Indonesia, and their subcontractors wouldn't help facilitate healthy working conditions. Do you think the responsibility to make it a healthy working condition is on Nike, is on the subcontractors, and on the Indonesian government?
You know, we could talk about that for hours probably and not necessarily resolve it, but what I boil down, to me what it boils down to is there are NGOs, non-government organizations that are, you know, certain stakeholders who are going to hold Nike responsible. So it almost doesn't matter. It's like guilt by association, right? So if any company has some bad behavior in their supply chain, today they're being held accountable for it. Now, one of the sort of weird quirks of that is we tend to think that the startups, like the startup beverage companies, oh, I've got this really cool iced tea that's, you know, fair trade grown and whatever, or I've got this new widget that does some really cool thing. We're so excited about startups, but we don't hold them to the same standards. We allow them to say this is naturally made, or this is, you know, you name whatever the moniker is that they're using to tell you, just to greenwash you about just how wonderfully made this thing is. But we don't demand, and the nonprofits by and large aren't demanding the same transparency of their supply chains that they demand of the large companies. And I think that's too bad, because to me, my ideal would be that these small companies, if you can build in environmental, social, and economic sustainability from the get-go, hopefully as you scale that company up, you can keep all those same pieces embedded in the company and in the ethos of the company. And then when they're acquired by the larger guys, maybe they become sort of more of the trendsetters. So, yeah, so where was I going before you asked that? You totally caught me off, but that's okay. So these social issues, and the environmental ones are very similar, you know, it's hard to know, again, you know, it's like 7 times removed. How do you have transparency into what are the water quality conservation practices that some company is using? What are they how much greenhouse gas emissions do they have, and are they really being climate smart? Or how much waste do they generate and that they don't find revenue streams for? So it's really waste that goes into a landfill and generates methane from that. So the real challenge that companies are having today is to think about transparency. So is this something that you guys talk about on campus? Do you guys have any? So when I was here in the early 80s, one of the things that we protested for was we wanted the campus to divest its endowment from, and another companies to divest from South Africa because of apartheid. So we were trying to, you know, not support organizations that supported slavery, basically, and segregation. So I don't know if this is something that you guys get involved in politically on campus, or social issues where you're saying, boy, we've just become aware of something the campus does and we're not really sure if it's a sustainable practice. Does that ring a bell?
There was a big
I'm not really
divestment.
talking about the unionizing on campus, though.
There was a big divestment drive last year to divest from fossil fuel manufacturers and stuff like that. I
Yeah,
wasn't personally that involved in it, but
so for the endowment.
yeah.
Right, so how do you get transparency into the endowment? I mean, and Doug probably knows this better than I don't know how easy it is to just go online and see what the endowment is invested in. But in a sense, that's how a lot of this is being pushed. There are pension funds, there are endowment, there are other funds that are invested in companies that people have questions about. And so your voice and where you spend your dollar is where you have the biggest impact, right? Because if you don't spend your dollar at the pump, but you buy a Tesla instead or an electric vehicle instead, you're sending a message, right, to the company, not only to the petroleum industry, but you're sending a message to the automobile industry that I want to get away from petroleum because of its climate change impacts. Who eats organic here? Wow, this is really, you guys are like messing with
You mean
my
like all the time?
stereotypes and generalizations, huh?
You mean like eat organic all the time?
Well, like if you were going somewhere and someone said, okay, do you have any dietary restrictions, you might, or you were setting up your own kitchen off campus. You put your dollar organic or non-GMO, or any vegans? Any vegetarians? Doug, you've got the weirdest glasses. This is so strange. It's really interesting. Yeah.
Oh, I was just raising my hand for the organic thing, but that's more of a medical thing.
Okay, but still, you could argue that's more important. Like suppose someone has a peanut allergy. This is what happens when you wake up at 3:30 in the morning to get on a plane. When someone has a peanut allergy, right? This is why it's really important that you know what's on the label and that you know you can trust that label. That's transparency. So when these things are for a medical reason, it's really, people get really vocal about it. And it's really hard. So, you know, companies are trying to figure out how can we do a better job of mapping our supply chain so we know every supplier, every first degree supplier, second, and gradually working back. How can we work with some of our larger suppliers who, you know, subcontract to many other suppliers? And how can we sort of all try to harmonize what we're looking for from a triple bottom line point of view? And how can we collect data so that we can actually show we're making progress against these things? Because with a publicly traded company, a company you're buying on a stock exchange, when they make public commitments, we are going to be carbon neutral by the year 2020 or 2030, or we're going to reduce our water usage by X amount by this time, that becomes something then that they are held accountable for. And if they don't achieve those goals, they have to explain why, and they've got to have really darn good reasons for why they're not. So that's, that then goes back to some of their transparency. You've got to be able to show, collect these data, see what sort of impact we're having, what sort of impact is our supply chain having, and then what kind of movement are we making. Yeah.
Is there like some, on the topic of transparency, is there like a party that like holds these companies accountable for like you said, like if they set a date like that, if they don't achieve whatever goal they set out to achieve by that date, is there some like party that holds them accountable on like issues?
So I think it depends on the industry. So when I worked at PepsiCo, I left there at the end of 2015. There was Oxfam? There was an NGO that was doing like, it was called Behind the Brands. And so they were looking at like the top 8 to 10 largest food and beverage companies and ranking them on certain parameters, at least, social and environmental parameters. But they were basing it on what was publicly available data. So there are many companies who, for a whole variety of reasons, don't want to publish all of their internal data. Competitive advantage, and could impact pricing. You just never know who's going to get unhappy with you for what you publish. So, so they were ranking the brands on certain issues, certain parameters. But I remember plenty of conversations in the company and with other companies where they were saying, well, but we're actually doing this, and Oxfam or whoever it was would say, well, you tell me you're doing that, but if you're not publishing it publicly, and then therefore I assume that you're sort of, from a regulatory point of view, putting your word behind it, then I don't believe you. Then there are other groups. There was something called the Good Guide, and that was another organization that was trying to publish certain, rank companies based on, or products based on transparency. But it ends up being, sort of wishy-washy. It's not great. And then you also have the problem of, well, suppose there's a company that's doing great in one thing but doing terribly in another. Are you going to not buy from them? Yeah.
I noticed that sustainability was more than just following the rules and regulations, but is there any sort of incentive system for companies that are sustainable or not really?
So more and more people are, have you heard of impact investors? So these are people who are investing, like in, whether it could be a hedge fund or in other sorts of investment, pension funds, other funds, where they say we want to invest a certain amount, or we're only investing in companies that we see are having a positive impact. Now, impact can be defined in many different ways. So some of those funds might say, if the product is made in a sustainable way, environmentally sustainable way, perhaps socially sustainable way, we're going to say it's something that we're going to invest in as an impact investor. However, that product might not be affordable by more than just the top 1% of a population. So is that really sustainable? Is that really having an impact? I would argue not. But the biggest way that this is incentivized is by those investors. If you're an actor in someone's supply chain, so again at PepsiCo and with other food and beverage companies, farmers would say, well, you want me to do all these practices, some of which I'm already doing, but you want me to collect the data to prove to you that I'm doing this. What's the incentive for me to do it? Are you going to pay me more per bushel of whatever? And many companies would say, well, this is just the cost of doing business. If you're not going to do it and you don't agree to start doing this, then we'll go buy somewhere else. I'm not sure that's quite the right answer. I think there's got to be a happy middle ground, because some of these things, you may need if you have a certain routine every day and someone says, you know what, you really ought to change your routine and brush your teeth after breakfast instead of before breakfast. And you say, well, I don't know, it's comfortable, it works for me, what's the incentive to do it? So if someone helps you in some way with some sort of incentive to just for a couple of days, or in a farmer's case, a couple of years, to change your practice and show that it's still going to be profitable to you, which is what some of the Farm Bill programs are meant to do, then I think that's kind of a way to sort of show that we're both sharing the risk here. It's not, I'm not just placing all the burden on you, my supplier. Any other questions? Okay, so there's also a whole bunch of things like the, you guys studied like the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, or the Declaration of Human Rights. It's a little while since I've used these titles, so I'm not getting them quite right. But a lot of companies will be signatories to some of these global initiatives. And so then they too will, if you see that a company is signing on to one of these initiatives that sounds really pretty cool for sustainability, its sustainability impact, you're probably more likely to invest with them. But then again, you want to say, well, is there really something there? And so that's where, again, this transparency comes into play. So how many of you guys have developed an app ever? A little bit, and yes? So what I think is really cool in my space, which has been agriculture, is the ag tech space is really sexy and growing tremendously. And what's kind of cool is you'll have a lot of like computer geeky Silicon Valley startup types who are working together with Aggies. Like it's a really unexpected, unusual partnership that is really cool because they're realizing we need more transparency. We need to figure out easy ways to collect data, who owns the data, how do you protect those data so that it doesn't get hacked. And then how do you also make the aggregated data available for more innovation? So it's a big area that people are working on, you know, so if you're going to keep going out and doing your app development, there's probably lots of opportunity in agriculture and sustainability. So if I diverge from PepsiCo, I guess let me just say one other thing. Another thing that can drive this is, right, it's perception. So companies will talk about these issues because they perceive that it's important to their investors and their stakeholders. And then I think the social issues, to me, it seems like there's more risk from not talking about the social issues and having someone find that something is going wrong in your supply chain. Because it sounds a lot worse than an environmental issue. So anyway, so now I'm, in December, I started co-chairing this climate crisis task force for my county in southern New York. And we're working to update our climate action plan. And one of the interesting pieces of that is community resilience and environmental justice. Those terms that you guys talk about, like environmental justice. So it can be, if you think about where you see some of the greatest impacts, say from the hurricane in Texas, or in the Carolinas, or in is it Mexico Beach, or Mexico, in Florida, up by the Panhandle. By and large, those are not the wealthiest people in this country who are being impacted. They tend to be poorer people, perhaps less well-educated, and actually probably less likely to know how to be a squeaky wheel and advocate for themselves and talk to their politicians and say, hey guys, the sea levels are rising, the climate is weirding, and my house is being washed away, and we need to do something. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we really address all the populations in the county, not just the more well-off ones who have a place to go if they lose power, or can afford a generator, or can, have a penthouse apartment instead of a lower apartment. So, I mean, in my mind, this also sort of fits as a social sustainability issue, thinking about how others are impacted. So, you guys, I understand, just closed down the campus for a couple of cold days, which was never heard about when I went here, and we would talk about 80 below with wind chill. But so who were the people who were most impacted by that really brutally cold weather?
Homeless.
Homeless, right? So I guess I would argue, what do you think, so how do we address it? How do we make sure that these social issues are considered and addressed? Be innovative, be creative. If you are the county exec for Poweshiek County, and you're trying to think about how do cold winters in general, or how's climate change impacting all my populations? Yeah.
I mean, just in general, when it comes to like climate science, there's a lack of like, I'd say, there's a lack of knowledge, and just like people tend to be very ignorant of it. So I think like there seems to be an improvement of communication of just, and like there seems to be a better like communication with the general public and kind of what's going on with this whole idea of like global weirding, kind of why our climate's kind of moving in, why we had a storm, kind of like why we did.
Mm-hmm.
So people understanding kind of this phenomenon, understand like why people like, maybe why we had like a, so it's more understandable like, we can connect like the deaths and stuff like that with like the actual science.
Mm-hmm. I would challenge you guys, not now unfortunately, but if you could think of some really successful, some great ideas for ways to communicate with people in a town and in a county where you're going to catch their attention, because what do we have, like, I don't know, 15-second attention spans today or something. I think you would go far, because it's really hard to think about how do you hit up everybody. So first of all, some of us watch CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, we all watch different news or listen to different radio stations, and God forbid we listen to a different one, right? Because we're sort of in our political bubbles, our social bubbles. So how do you get people aware, and how do you get people aware of these issues in a way that's not challenging to whatever their set of beliefs is? So I agree with you, but that's one of the big stumbling blocks. But I think just even thinking about social programs, right? So maybe helping people understand why is it important to have housing for the homeless, or to have shelters for the homeless, because some people might say, why should we spend the money on that? But then you say, well, it's cost avoidance if everybody has a place to go, because otherwise we're suddenly paying a lot more money on these weather extremes. And I mean, it's a conversation we're having in the county right now, right? You can spend a little bit of money today and do something that seems glitzy and sort of has a little bit of impact. Or in a financially strapped county, you can say, all right, we got to tighten our belts a little bit more and spend some money today, but we're going to actually in the long run save a lot of money, because we're going to be making changes to infrastructure in a way that whenever we have these weirdings and any other events, odd catastrophic events, we're going to spend less money because we're already going to be more resilient. It's sort of like if you're really fit, you eat healthily and you work out, chances are, for the majority of us, your medical bills are lower, right? Because you sort of built that resilience in from the get-go. So now I just, last week, started a job with the American Farmland Trust. Has anybody heard of them? Not surprised. I figured you'd heard of PepsiCo, and you'd heard of the EPA or USDA. So the American Farmland Trust is a nonprofit that basically wants to prevent the loss of farmland to development. Because if we don't have farms, we don't have, what? Food, yeah. And we don't have fibers either. One of the really big things in this recent farm bill is that hemp is now legal to be produced for, like for fibers. You know, because it's, I don't need to tell a bunch of college students what hemp is in the same family as other plants, right? So, and we also work with farmers to put conservation practices on the ground, and we also are trying to make farmland more accessible for new farmers, whether it's just youngsters going into farmers or someone who suddenly says, at the age of 35, I've suddenly decided I want to raise alpacas and sheep for wool, but I don't have the capital to buy land. I don't even know where farmland is. How can we sort of marry up land with farmers? So I think an interesting aspect of sustainability when you bring for-profit companies together with not-for-profits is they tend to think differently, right? So we stereotype that for-profit companies are always guys thinking about their the bottom line profit, right? And we sort of tend to assume they don't have much of a conscience because they're only thinking about the dollar. And I think that's an extreme, but there's probably a reason that we stereotype that way. And then one will say, well, many nonprofits don't worry so much about the dollar, they're worried more about their impact. And so what I think is interesting is when you sort of can marry the two together and start getting nonprofits to really think in a more economically sustainable way of really focusing, it's not nonprofit because they're nonprofits, but thinking about the impact of the dollar for, you know, so the economic sustainability of the organization as well as then what's their social and economic and environmental impact. So I've now rambled on for about an hour, and I would like you guys to, you know, ask some questions. Let's get a conversation going. Yes?
So I was just curious, I know that in Iowa especially, there's a lot of farm-related injuries, and you know, regulating that is always an issue just because it's often difficult and expensive to do so for the farmers. And you talked about some of the sustainability aspects. How difficult is it when you're trying to work with, you know, different farmers? I know you work with smaller farmers in New York, but how difficult is that, you know, trying to convince them that it's, you know, both parties are kind of in it together?
For accident safety, you're saying?
Not necessarily, but for, you know, the type of work that you do.
So the way I approached it earlier in my career was, I think, pretty humbly, and I said, you're the farmer, you know what you're doing better, you know how to, you know, raise dairy cows and grow milk in essence better than I do, but I'm the environmental expert, so how do we sort of merge our two expertises, our two areas of expertise to make your operation more efficient? And then when I'm talking about more efficient, I'm not just talking about from a dollars today point of view, I'm talking about resource use efficiency in general, whether it's human resources or natural resources or financial resources. And I think it's important to not go into it with a real arrogance, because, I mean, I guess if I had come from a farming background, maybe I could have been more arrogant, right? But people tend to shut down when someone is sort of arrogantly telling them what to do. So, if I dare say so, it's along the lines of what I learned being a parent of a 22-year-old young man, right? When someone tells you what to do, you don't really want to do it. But if you sort of come at whatever it is that needs to be done from a different point of view and say, well, you know, this is like for the family sustainability, or there's a reason for doing this, I'm not just telling you to take the garbage out, then there's more of a willingness to do it. Yeah.
Could you give some examples of like strategies that you and farmers would come up with to make their practice more sustainable?
Well, so, how many of you are from New England? or have been to, driven throughout New England? Not too much. Okay, well, in the northeastern United States, we have a lot of dairy farms. And we historically had a lot of dairy farms. Actually, if anyone's from California or Idaho, you've got a lot of dairy farms there too. But in New England, they traditionally would put the barn and the paddock right by a stream. And the reason they did that was they could take those old metal milk containers after they milked the cow and they could put it in the stream to chill the milk, because they didn't have refrigeration and electricity for refrigeration. This was a while ago. And also because then you could just bring the cattle there to drink or easily get water from the stream. But that's okay if you've got 5, 10, 15 cattle. When you start getting 100, 200, 1,000, whatever, suddenly that situation, I'm getting to your question, but suddenly that situation is not so tenable, it's not so sustainable, because let's say you've got 500 head of cattle in this corral, and there's a stream right there, and it rains, well, all the manure is likely to run off into the stream. Or suddenly, so what we would see is, you know, in order to get from this field to that field, you have to go, there's a stream in the way. And, you know, the cattle, they get to the stream, they drink, they lollygag around, they pee, they poop, and suddenly you've got, you know, nitrogen and phosphorus and perhaps pathogens in the water. So one of the things that we were trying to do a lot of was get farmers to think about how do you get from point A to point B without going in the stream. And, you know, it's as simple as, but not always as simple as it sounds, having just a bridge, like a little walkway that goes over the stream, and then thinking about how do we get you to use those pastures way back there? Well, they don't have any water, so then it's pumping water up there. Which, I mean, has a consequence, surely, because how are you making that pump run? And, you know, I had farmers who would say, okay, in principle, I agree with what you're saying, but the way that the Catskill Mountains are shaped, they tend to have a lot of sort of closed-in river valleys like this, and so when it rains a lot, the water just comes rushing through, and they'll say, you know, I've seen it blow out a bunch of bridges, so whatever we do here, we're not going to be able to engineer it. So then you have to come up with a plan B. None of them are dumb by any means. They're very, you know, very innovative, clever people, and again, in general, I've seen want to do the right thing. It's just, I think also, sometimes it's nice to have an outside perspective, throwing some ideas at you and see what you think might work for your management style. And what might work for one farmer over here might not work for this person because they have different management styles.
So is this the kind of thing that you would do for PepsiCo, or was it that more of like a maybe working within, from a distance kind of thing?
So PepsiCo, it was more developing a program. Like
Yeah.
it developed a social, environmental, and economic sustainability program, a sustainable farming initiative that was rolled out to crop farmers and dairy farmers. But I had a really cool, you know, on the social side, I had this really cool project in West Bengal, India, and partnered with a nonprofit called CARE. And it was a project that was focusing on empowering women and focusing on training them on proper nutrition as a way of increasing productivity in their household and in their raising of potatoes, which were sold to the company for potato chips. So the data show that the more that women have control over the family finances and smallholder farmers, the more that the family tends to eat better, and the more that kids tend to go to school and stay in school longer. And in India, there's a big problem with anemia. And so part of this was teaching women what to grow in their home gardens, you know, some of the leafy greens that had high iron content. And some of it was just as simple as identifying, like, it was really cool. We went to these communities and said, okay, we had men and women sitting together and said, who's a farmer here? And who do you think raised their hand? It's pretty much the men. In many countries, you know, men are the landowners. And so the women didn't consider themselves farmers. And we said, well, okay, so what do you help out, to the women, do you help out with raising potatoes? What is your job in the family and on the farm? And they say, well, we take care of the draft animals, we plant the potato seed, and then, you know, the men do other parts. And so the interesting thing was, well, if your contract is with the men, then the companies are generally gonna have conversations, training conversations with the men. And how many of you played that game, Operator? Remember that from when you were a kid? You know, you tell your neighbor the message and it attenuates over time, and at the end it sounds nothing like what the first person said, right? Well, so if you're training someone who is not the person who plants the seed on how to plant the seed, hopefully she gets some degree of the message, but she's probably not getting all of the message. So one of the things was like, I think it was the potato seed, you know, it's like a little baby potato. If you cut it more than 2 times, I think it is, your productivity decreases significantly. Like you get fewer potatoes from it in the future. But if if the women had never been told that, then, you know, common sense would say, well, if I can cut it into 4 potatoes and I can get this many plants, I can cut it into 6 pieces or 8 pieces and get even more plants. We'll be rich because I'll be growing more potatoes, but the science didn't bear that out. So part of this was to educate, to sort of identify who had what tasks, make it clear to both the men and the women what their tasks, like make the men aware of what the women were doing and the women aware of what the men were doing, and just sort of helping to train the women on having agency or the ability to speak up and say, I think we should do this, or well, this is actually what I do, so I need to go to this training. And if the culture won't allow me to go to this training, we have to think about a way to make it safe for me as a woman to go to this training. Really fascinating project, and actually American Farmland Trust is doing learning circles with women who are non-operating farm landowners. And things like when a husband dies and the woman is inheriting the land, she's not used to going to the banker, she's not used to going to the seed provider, the fertilizer, and a lot of them apparently won't listen to the women when she talks to them. So it's all about saying, no, you have every right to be asking these questions, and these are the questions that you should ask. So it's sort of a neat other angle of the social side of industries. What else?
I was just wondering, like, in your time working with like farmers, if you ever had any kind of like trouble, like communication, or just like talking and trying to convey like how to have better economic sustainability. Just because like in some of like the articles that I've read, kind of like recently, I know like it's becoming more of an issue with like ecological like sustainability, becoming more of an issue in like Iowa farm areas and stuff like that, and like farmers are starting to notice more. But like some farmers are having more of an aversion to like kind of like the topic of like climate change and stuff like that. They're not really so like they understand their farmers aren't really planning to be doing as well, but they don't really like when it comes to like picking up on the word climate change and stuff like that and like looking at that kind of aspect, they really don't like it as much. And so I was just wondering if you kind of have like issues trying to like with talking to farmers, kind of like convey issues and maybe why like. Or maybe how they can change their farms, and like maybe they weren't really like wanting to pick up on these ideas.
Well, I think one of the important things is to, especially with climate change, because there are people who don't acknowledge its existence or that it's caused by by people. I sort of say, you know what? Part of me says I don't really care whether you believe it or not. If you use less commercial fertilizer, you use only what your soil test and your crop status tells you that you need of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other micronutrients, then you're wasting money. If you use more than you need, you're wasting money. That's money going down the drain. If you put manure on the field without looking at what the weather report is for this evening or tomorrow, and a rainstorm comes along, that's money down the drain. In that river, by the way, and those fish are dying. It goes down to the Gulf of Mexico where the fish are dying. So I think it's important to kind of suss out the people you're working with and see where their biases are and what their motivations are. And 9 times out of 10, it will come back to finances. And there's no reason for anyone to be throwing money down the drain. I think the challenge becomes when if you're dealing with a population that's so focused on making things work for today because they don't have any extra money, they don't have the luxury of thinking about tomorrow. Because when you can start thinking about tomorrow, you're more willing to spend money today so that you can earn money tomorrow. And you just have to sort of find the right framework for that conversation. I mean, with the same group of men and women in this village in India, what was it? I asked a question of, what are your hopes and dreams for your kids? And my son was, I don't know, 19 or something at the time, and he came with me on that trip. So I was thinking, well, I have hopes and aspirations for my son, and I always have since he was born. And it was interesting, these people, they are so focused on food for today and tomorrow, that the whole idea of aspirations for your kids, what do you dream about for your kids in the future, is a luxury. So that's not the right way to couch the conversation. But to me, it was important to find that out, because otherwise, I'm talking about, oh, you're making the world better for your kids tomorrow. Well, I'm really focused on my kids today. So, what else? If you were going to focus, so back to what Doug was mentioning, the project of making Grinnell more sustainable, what sort of issues would you think of? What do you notice in the dining room? Yeah.
Food being wasted.
Food being wasted.
Same thing.
Same thing. Okay. So, what is it? Is it something like 40% of post-consumer waste in the United States? 40% of food is wasted, post-consumer, like we throw it out from our fridge or from our plates in the United States. And if you go into emerging markets, it's more like there's 30 or 40% post-harvest waste. So then it becomes an issue of how do you not waste the product in the field, and how do you get it to market without it going to waste along the way. Plus, so what happens to that food? Is it composted on campus? Some? Or yes? Some.
And they're trying to work to do more composting this semester.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so because if you put it in a landfill, you're going to have methane emissions, right?
I think there's also a group that brings it to the community and people around who need it as well.
Yeah, okay. And so that was a really interesting thing. I think it was President Clinton who passed a law when he was in office that was like a Good Samaritan bill, because generally your fear is, well, if we have a party here and there's like donuts left over or bagels left over, our concern in this litigious country that we have here is, well, if somebody eats those bagels or those donuts and gets sick, whether it's because of them or not, they're going to sue us. And so this Good Samaritan law basically said, well, if the intent is to help somebody out, then you're okay. And I'm probably simplifying it quite a bit, but that was sort of, what's important is to realize what are the hurdles that you have to overcome in order to have successful solutions. So it's kind of like, how do you have to incentivize people or talk to people so that these things can work? What else? Do you guys, I don't know, leave your water running when you brush your teeth? Or yes? Yes? Huh? Or stay in the shower for half an hour? Or leave the lights on when you leave the room? What do you do with your textbooks when you're done with them?
Just keep them in the bin.
Sell them.
Keep them and sell them. Okay. And I can certainly understand either one. I still have some of mine. I thought I would look at them again, and I haven't. Some, I haven't. How about financial aid on campus? Would you say that's an aspect of social sustainability? Huh?
I would definitely say so. So, for instance, in the education department, like students can do the licensure program and go and get their teaching license. However, they don't get financial aid during the extra semester that they have to stay. They have to fend for themselves, and they're not getting paid because they're doing student teaching.
Oh, that's the classroom stint you're saying.